Oh,
42, 20.
I don't have that many fingers and toes. That's
You
just
can
weird.
count to 20.
Yeah, but you said 42. That's just a high number. That's just not really fair. So, hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. The podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. I'm looking at you, Doc. But without further ado, Miss E.C. Ambrose, sometimes called Elaine by her friends, can you introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Hello. So my name is Elaine Isaac. I write principally as E.C. Ambrose or as E. Chris Ambrose. I describe my brand as knowledge-inspired adventure fiction, and you do not want to be my hero.
And they say knowing is half the battle, and the other half is violence. Her
Sounds
heroes
right.
find that out the hard way, I'm told. So we'll get more to how her heroes are going to feel about her later in the interview, dear listener. But Doc, before we decide how far we go, she's got to answer the religion questions.
Okay. You weren't going to say how did we first find them?
Oh, you're right. I forgot. I blame Doc because, now it's not cool to blame Russia anymore. So as far as I know, this is a guest that came to us through...
Nick.
Oh, he's not here. That's right. Nick Garber. It's his fault. Buy his comic.
Clearly.
But I think Elaine came to us through Mel Todd when she posted in one of her writing groups.
She did, but here's the crazy one. I met her years before at Dragon Con. So when she was like, and I went, I know that book. And then I went, wait, I know you. Yes, we have to have you on because I have your book and I liked it. It was so much fun.
How cool is that? Now, you're not the person that I faked my own death to sell the book, right?
No. I was in the vendor's room and I was like, and you're like, hey, yeah, no, this guy does like medicine, but like medieval medicine. And he also butchers meat. And I'm like, that sounds cool. It's a very dark book, but I really enjoy it.
Thank you.
And so, I mean, how could I not? Right? You never know who you're going to meet. And that's what I always tell authors when they ask me, what did I do? I went, when you go out of your hotel room, remember, you don't know who the people are that you're going to meet or where they're going to be later in life. And so, see, this is a perfect example. Many years ago, when my child was still in diapers, I met this wonderful woman while I was fleeing him and hiding at Dragon Con.
So first, he's not that old, so diapers weren't that long ago for him. He's still a baby. And second, I want to hear the story where she faked her own death to sell a book, because I might need to take some notes.
So, yeah, the Dragon Con booth, and I believe I was actually in costume as a medieval barber surgeon on this particular occasion. But I was part of a group author booth in the dealer's room, and part of the shtick was you sort of, stand by the aisle and have a copy of your book in your hands and chat with people as they came by and say things like, oh, we're authors signing and selling our books. And so this, I believe it was a gentleman, stopped and said, oh, is that one of the books that you wrote? And I said, yeah, this is Elijah Barber. It's the first book in this series, medieval surgery. I hand the book over to him. He looks it over for me and he says, well, yeah, I mean, it sounds pretty good, but, you'll sign it for me. I said, oh, absolutely. He's like, yeah, but it'll be worth more when you die. So I took a pause and then started to choke dramatically, rolled my eyes back and keeled over in the middle of the aisle. And he kind of looked down at me and went, I guess I got to buy it now.
That's great.
So yeah, the Dragon Con dealership was a lot of fun, and I hope to be back there someday.
We have such interesting people in our community, don't we?
I mean, I'd buy it after that too.
I think after that kind of a display, you really have to.
I think you would have felt really embarrassed if, everybody who of course, but by then was turning to stare and figure out what was going on.
So Nick Garber, if you watch this afterwards, because you didn't make it today, because, the government wanted you to protect the border and do your job. But if you do, when you go to Comic-Con in California, you need to take notes, because I want a better story than this. You could do better. Challenge to you, Nick Garber. I'm going to tell him this too.
Throne.
And then we'll have you two on and you compare notes, like who did the better death scene.
Cool. All right. I'm in.
All right.
We could. My money is on her. Um, so on to the infamous religion questions. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
I was raised in the Church of Star Trek, but I have gone over to the dark side, and I'm going to say Star Wars.
I hear they have cookies over there.
Absolutely.
So, now the next one, because we are polytheistic, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, or The Wheel of Time?
Lord of the Rings.
So have you
Makes
read the
sense.
others, or are you just a purist, or that's the only one in the group that you've read?
I've read some of the others. I can't claim to have read the complete works.
To be fair, The Wheel of Time is like 10 inches
longer
thick
than
per
all
novel.
3 volumes, yes.
So, I've seen Bibles that are thinner than some of those novels.
Although, yeah, when I was judging for the World Fantasy Awards, one of the books that we got in was the Wheel of Time Companion. And not having read the complete series, I was like, well, I'll flip through this thing and sort of see what it has to offer. And reading some of the entries in there is kind of set up like an encyclopedia, but for Wheel of Time. And it started to get me really interested in those books. And I thought, well, someday maybe if I have broken my arm and can't write for a while, like a really long while, then maybe I will see if I can get back into them.
It's going to take more than 6 weeks.
You could always dictate, and then you don't have to worry about it because you've dictate with a broken arm.
See,
unless you just really want to read the books.
Unfortunately, I'm just probably never going to read The Wheel of Time under those circumstances. This is my daughter's excuse for not reading whatever I say is an awesome book that she should totally read. She just says, well, I'll read that when I have finished reading The Wheel of Time.
I like that. Good for her.
I'd give her to her own audiobook and say, here you go.
And you can fast forward it that way.
I mean, like, well, you could listen to it at like 1.5 speed, although narrators, I'm told, really hate it if you tell them that. But I think like Brandon Sanderson and Robert Jordan together, like their books are like, you've got to just slot 2 weeks to listen to it.
George R. Martin's not any better. Or David Weber.
But I can't read George R. Martin until he finishes the series. Otherwise, I'll be disappointed.
He's never finishing the series.
I know, so I'll never read the books.
I think he will, because he's that kind of guy. So I didn't
really... Oh, no. My theory is he has them finished. He's just not going to release them until afterwards because he likes the attention.
Can't promise you that, yeah. But the I remember not really sort of getting Game of Thrones until I heard David Hartwell talking about George Martin's past and how he was a chess master who used to sort of travel around the countryside making extra money by playing multiple chess games at a time, like setting up in a high school gymnasium with 40 chess boards and walking around that room and playing 40 chess games at a time. And I thought, well, there you go. That explains everything.
Interesting.
No. Just no. I could not do it. So, but then again, I don't play chess. So.
Do you play, Elaine?
Not anymore. Like I used to dabble, but I was never. I always felt that I should play chess as a proper nerd. It seemed like the thing to do, and yet it didn't really take hold of me the way that it did some of my friends.
I play with my youngest, but I'm not what you would call probably that good. But I at least know what the pieces are and what they can do.
Yes, when JR tries to feel smart, he asks me questions about chess, and then I ask him questions about chemistry and math.
So we've established that chemistry isn't real. It was made up by the government to trick the gullible.
No, that's why Pi Day was made up so that people could sell more math.
I don't know about that, but let's ask her about her first love.
So, which was your first love, sci-fi or fantasy?
See, this is kind of a tricky one because the answer I think would have to be Ray Bradbury. And sci-fi or fantasy? Yes. Technically, I guess sci-fi, or at least that's where he's usually shelved. But obviously a lot of his work is fantasy or it crosses that boundary.
I think for people who really started reading, particularly with some of the more established classic authors, that the boundaries back then were not as clearly defined. They were more permeable and lumped together.
Yeah, that certainly is what it seems like. I had a conversation with a friend of mine. Actually, I just got off the phone with him before I came over to chat with you guys. And at one point, he's a ex NASA. So we were sort of talking about like how you got started in the thing. And he said, how did you get started as a writer? And I said, well, I remember reading Ray Bradbury and just the feelings that his writing evoked for me, and thinking someday I want to do that. I want to be the person who brings out those feelings. And my friend said, that's funny because he got into astrophysics because he read Bradbury and he thought, I want to do that. I want to send people to Mars. And, we've both been inspired by the same author, but my take on it was I wanted to make people believe that they could go to Mars.
Well, I think it's important to make people believe they can go to Mars because that's how it happens. I think both are equally important, but I really think that you have to first inspire people to achieve before people can achieve. Otherwise, they kind of accidentally achieve.
Right.
So
the humanities can blaze the way in a lot of cases, that and then the sciences come in and build the infrastructure that makes things happen.
Yes, I definitely think so. I think the first time I read something about that was in an Anne McCaffrey book, and it was a character looked at somebody and went, if one person can think it, another person can build it.
Well, okay, I am not muted. So the Star Trek, for instance, has inspired scientists to actually say, is this possible? And let me figure out the math. So you've got the Mexican physicist Miguel Albuquerque, I think is how you say it. I'm butchering his last name. But he's the one who did the Alcubierre drive, which is the mathematical formula for FTL. So, I mean, I think the science fiction can inspire people to say, is this even possible, and how would I do it?
Hey, we have clear metal now.
And tablets sort of thing that the Star Trek had them just punching at, cardboard or whatever it was on the prop side in the 70s. So, I mean, like, and this isn't just a Star Trek thing. Like, every time someone says, well, what would I need to do that? And then they make up some hand wavium. And years later, scientists will say, I'm a nerd. I read that book. I wonder if that's possible. Let me figure it out. So I think there's room for that. And that's the beauty of speculative fiction, is it can inspire the better angels among us.
Yeah, I think science fiction has that sort of reputation for being the fiction of ideas. And I think that on the fantasy side, that oftentimes fantasy is sort of denigrated as, well, you can just make things up, which is kind of true, but you have to make them up in a clear, crisp, and believable fashion. So it's a lot more complicated than literally making things up. But where we're coming from is often inspiring those sort of feats of humanity, of the things that people are capable of that maybe they didn't know that they were. Philip Zimbardo, who was the guy behind the Stanford Prison Experiment, has now moved on and has a nonprofit called the Hero Project. And part of what he's trying to do is figure out, how do you inspire people to feats of heroism? One of the conclusions he reached early on is that you do that by story, by telling the kinds of narratives that get people excited, that get them inspired, that get them feeling like, I could do that. I could step up and be that person.
So even as far back as Tolkien, when he wrote the Lord of the Rings, was his stated goal was to create sort of the legend and myth ethos, the hero's journey for modern, Britons. And I think even if you're not doing it, because we've certainly started seeing fantasy stories come out and, rooted in other cultures, as much like, the Lord of the Rings is rooted in the Europe, proto-Europes. But they are basically creating modern hero stories that inspire people to be the better versions of themselves. So I think that's equally as valuable, because tech by itself is nothing. It's the perfect pairing of the man and machine. And no, I'm not going full cyberpunk, but like the two together is what makes things possible. So, but anyway, that's a whole nother fireside chat we'll have to have someday, and I'll get Doc to schedule that one. I'm sure she'll
Okay.
remember. Maybe
Put it on the list.
put it on the list.
Wait, JR, you were speaking?
You're voted off my island. All right. So, what is your first memory of
I
engaging?
am your island.
What is your first memory of engaging in speculative fiction as a genre? Was it watching it on the TV, reading the books, Ray Bradbury, or playing some sort of game? Like, where do you think you first discovered the concepts?
So it's definitely down to my dad. He was a fan of all the things from a pretty early state. And when I was young, we had the tradition after dinner on Sundays that we would read a book out loud around the table. And of course, when these things first started, I was just listening to the stories. We'd be a chapter or two. I remember we read The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, was one of the early books. And we did read The Lord of the Rings in that family format after doing The Hobbit and probably some other things as
Those are
well.
long chapters.
They are. And I remember one of the first chapters that sort of I felt ready to read out loud to be part of the family tradition was from The Lord of the Rings. And I remember it being one of the chapters that had lots of dwarvish names for things. And just kind of stumbling over this. There's one passage where Gimli is literally pointing to all of the mountains around them and giving the dwarvish name and also the elvish name and the human language. And I was a little surprised we didn't get the Ent names for mountains in there too. But it's a lot of mountains, and I'm a big fan of mountains, but maybe I didn't need all of the names.
No, like I like a lot of details in a story. I know some people prefer the sort of the popcorn fiction of the pulp era where it was just just the story, move the story along and don't give all the details. And so I tell people I like a lot of details, and they're like, "Oh, so you Lord of the Rings?" And I'm like, "Well, Lord of the Rings is good, but I think maybe he took it just a little too far." There's a happy medium in there
Kind of
somewhere.
detail. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not just the details; it's what the details and whether they're important. And I'm not sure that knowing every mountain's name was necessarily important. What's even wilder is when you realize he wrote that as one novel, and the publisher was like, "Yeah, maybe we should split it up." So what is it you love about speculative fiction as a genre?
I like that it can hold up a funhouse mirror to our reality and kind of distort things in a way that reveals the truth we didn't know was there. Whether that's science fiction, kind of extrapolating a potential future and looking at the implications of technology, or fantasy that is kind of holding up that mirror to human nature and saying, what could people be if we had powers or access to things that we do not now possess? And kind of giving that reflection that is just a sidestep away from reality. And sometimes I think that helps us to think more deeply about it than if we had read a similar story, but with a real world setting in which all of the details were sort of precisely contemporary. Sometimes those things are more off-putting because you can't, well, I don't know if I see myself in there. I don't know if I want to be in there. But, I want to be in Narnia. I want to be in Middle Earth. I want to be in Old Barzoom.
Yeah, I wonder how many kids were disappointed when they opened their closets and they just couldn't get there. I know I checked mine.
Yeah, I mean, there's that amazing C.S. Lewis quote that, the child who is raised on fantasy does not despise a real forest because it is not fantastic. To that child, every forest becomes magic.
Yeah. So how did your love of speculative fiction as a genre and all the possibilities that it gives humanity, like how did that translate into you telling stories in that space?
So my first stories were probably actually fanfic for Dragon Riders of Pern. During that era, as I was talking about the Bradbury connection, when I wanted to be that person who could tell the stories, but I hadn't quite worked out what my stories were to tell.
I actually know several authors who got started writing by doing fanfic of Pern. So
yeah,
you're in good company.
I actually had the opportunity to tell Anne McCaffrey that. I think it was at there's a science fiction writers induction into the Grandmasters, Masters Hall of Fame, and she was there, and we'd all had name tags on, as one does at these events. And I saw her, and I sort of got my courage up to go over. I'm going to talk to Anne McCaffrey, and I'm going to tell her this story, that one of my first speculative stories that I ever wrote was Dragon Riders of Pern fanfic. And I went over to tell her this, and she turned to her assistant. She was using a wheelchair at that time, and turned to her assistant and said, "Elaine Isaac, we have that book on our shelf, don't we?" And I was like, ah, I'm going to die. And McCaffrey has my book on her shelf.
That's awesome.
And it was just extraordinary. I was so glad that I had been able to have that moment.
That's cool. So do you have any of those stories still?
I think I might. When I was young and even more arrogant than perhaps I am now, I had this impression that somebody somewhere would one day want sort of my collected writings. And of course, they would be more special because some of them were handwritten and some of them were typewritten on a literal typewriter and all of that. So I think I still have my archive of sort of antique words, which I'm a little bit afraid to go and look at.
Okay.
You know what? At least she is honest about it. We've had some authors go, no. And then later they're like, yeah, I have it. I'm just not going to admit to it.
Would I show it to you? Maybe not.
Well, I know if she sets up a Patreon, maybe that could be like the top tier. You can pay enough, she'll let you look at it.
Cool. My Anne McCaffrey fanfic.
Yeah. So many authors let their own real life experiences influence the stories they tell. So were there any specific formidable moments you think that shape you as a storyteller?
The day that I was stalked by a tiger.
What?
Do tell.
It was so my husband and I wanted to have kids, pretty early on, but we wanted to do some big traveling before we settled down. So we had these 2 trips, one to India and Nepal, and then the next year, one to China and Mongolia. And on the trip to Nepal, we were staying at the Tiger Tops Resort. This could be a very long story. It could be a relatively short one. I'll go for the relatively short version.
You've
And
got time. Keep going.
Tiger Tops is one of the places where you go to hopefully see tigers in the wild. It's one of their it's located in one of their national parks. So the first night we were there, we were staying at what they call the Treetops Lodge, which is basically a lodge on stilts. So I was awakened in the night by this kind of strange noise, and it's my first night in the jungle, and how cool is that? And I'm really desperate to know what is making this huffing sound that I could hear. And the next morning, when we walked down the steps to the ground to go to breakfast, and there were very large cat prints through the lodge area underneath the building we had been sleeping in. And one of the guides said, "Oh yeah, there was a leopard that has been hanging around, and it walked through last night." Wow, that's really cool. I wish I had been able to see it, and how great would that be? So we went off during the day and did various things, and we did a river cruise and all the things one does. And then my husband and I were scheduled to spend the next night at the tented camp. So there was one other tourist who was coming along as well. So we had 2 guides, one in front and one in back, and the 3 tourists. And each of the guides had a very large stick. So, we're walking along the trail. And of course, the reason you go to a place called the Tiger Tops is because you want to see tigers. So they're telling us about, sort of what to expect, and that the thing about tigers is, if you see them, it's because they're not hungry, because they're an ambush predator. So ordinarily they don't want to be seen as long as they're hungry. Okay, that's kind of interesting. And they would stop and point out, oh, here's where, a tiger clawed this tree. And, male tigers are really territorial. So we're in the territory of this particular male tiger. Each one incorporates 2 female tigers, sort of going along this whole thing. And then we start seeing tiger tracks along the trail. And so the guides are all excited. Look, here's tiger tracks and how big they are and how they compare to the leopard tracks we saw last night. And then we get to this beautiful little waterfall, spreads out into kind of a broad but shallow stream. And there's a little bridge that goes across it. So we start crossing this little bridge, and we get to the other side, and the tiger tracks are still wet. And we haven't seen a tiger at this point. And of course, one of the things that they had said is, if you see the tiger, it's because they're not hungry. So, and you could see the two guides sort of pick up those very large hiking staffs that they're carrying and stand up a little straighter and look around a little more intently as we're completing our walk. And it's, I think it was about 3 miles or so from the lodge to the tented camp. So the tented camp consists of a bunch of sort of Girl Scout style, if you will, or I suppose military style canvas tents with the wooden poles inside. And they do have flush toilets that are adjacent, which is awfully nice, So, but it's just canvas. And there's like a sort of central pavilion where you go for meals. So we're shown to our tent. We go in for the evening meal, and there is sort of the head naturalist who's going to talk to us more about tigers and the sort of the ecology of tigers, the life cycle of tigers, the fact that when a tiger has started attacking baby rhinos, that that tiger is older and they're looking for slower prey, and that's often when they start to get injured and when they start to to go after people potentially, and then they're telling stories about how occasionally people just go disappear in the woods because they go out to collect wood from their village and all they ever find is a sandal. And one tiger that a couple of years ago that had gone in and dragged a woman out of her house because they didn't have a door that would close. They just had a curtain. And then the cook came out to serve, and he had scars down one side of his face and was missing an ear. So we got to hear his tiger attack story, and then we got sent to bed. So now I'm lying in my bed in the tent, and we were told that there's going to be 2 guards at each end of the camp, and they have guns, but we're not to worry. So I'm lying in my bed, and I start hearing this sound, which is a lot like the sound of the leopard from the previous night. And I start thinking, oh God, it's right outside my tent. Do I have anything I can use as a weapon? And I don't think they've told us, like, what do you do? Is this a case where you are supposed to make yourself look big or be loud? Or do you play dead or do you fight back? I don't know. Suddenly I don't have the right information. And the biggest, most dangerous thing I had with me was my telephoto lens on my camera. So I'm lying there in my bed, shaking like a leaf and holding my telephoto lens as if it will save me. And the huffing noise gradually goes away. And I don't know if I actually got any sleep that night. My husband slept through the whole thing, of course.
Of course.
But I realized afterwards that it wasn't just like, oh, I was walking through the jungle and, it was an area where there are tigers. It was every step of that journey. The fact that the guides were telling us these stories about, how to identify tigers and how to identify tigers that are more likely to attack humans, pointing out the signs of the tiger, crossing the river and finding that the tracks were still wet. And it was a masterclass in how to build suspense. How do you lay in the foreshadowing for something that's going to happen later on? How do you bring someone to the edge of their seat and make them think that their camera will somehow save their life? And just kind of without any one of those things, without hearing the guide's stories, without seeing the man who didn't have an ear, would that night have been as terrifying as it was? And I think it would not. So it was an inadvertent class in suspense, and yet it's a lesson that I've carried with me all this time.
So looking back on it in hindsight, do you think that some of that was put on, like the prop of the guy's injury, or do you think that was legit? He was really scarred? Because now I'm wondering, like, did they create this ambiance to scare people, or was there just really this tiger hunting everybody?
Well, obviously there were a lot more details than what I just gave you, including some things that could be corroborated later, like the idea that the guide the chef who had lost his ear had been an elephant driver. So when he lost his ear, he was out collecting elephant grass to feed to the elephants. And tigers usually don't care about elephants. That's why you use them when you're going to hunt for tigers, or in this case, to go on a tiger safari and look for them with your camera. So oftentimes when people go out in that area, they'll actually wear a mask on the back of their head. And you can see these masks, and there's a lot of photos of them and imagery about them, because the tiger doesn't want to be seen. So if the tiger can see your face, it is less likely to attack. So they would have these masks on the back of their head as a way to defend themselves. So I'm sure that part of the storytelling around the campfire that night was sort of like, here's the more exciting, the more lurid details about tigers. But there were certainly a lot of aspects of it that I don't think they could have invented.
All right. So we'll write that up there with Marissa, who had an alligator thrown at her. So you're right up there with the animal stories. I think yours wins because, tigers,
Yeah, no, I think yours actually wins. So,
but also, if you're listening and you have a Yeti story, we're here to talk about it. I'm just saying.
JR has a soft spot in his heart for Yetis.
Aw, it better be a very large soft spot, because Yetis.
Naturally, there's a movie in the 80s about a Bigfoot that was like adopted by a family. I can't remember the name of it.
That's right. Yes.
So I remember watching that as a kid. I'm like, I want a pet Yeti.
So many bad jokes. They're just writing themselves in my head. So let's get back to the script before I say something too off color. So, transitioning into things from the fandom angle, have you had any cool fan art or a cosplay of one of your characters yet?
Well, interestingly, so one of the series of books that I write is called The Bone Guard, and I describe them as if Indiana Jones had served in special forces, it might be something like this. So archaeological thriller novels inspired by my research into medieval stuff often. And my son is a thriller reader. He's a fan of Clive Cussler and those guys. So I've actually read my books with him, which is kind of fun. And then when book 4, The Maya Bust, came out in September, I roped him into coming with me to the bookstore because I knew that the event had to be small because COVID, and I wanted to simulcast to Facebook. So he sort of grudgingly came along to hold my phone, basically, so that I could get it on Facebook Live. And I read a passage from the book, which, he had read the book and he enjoyed the book. So we're driving home and he's like, that was pretty neat. Next time I do that, I think I should, maybe I should get in character somehow. It would be great. I could cosplay as Grant Casey. I could have, the shorts that are described, the logo that's, I'm going to need some sunglasses though, and a hat. And so now he's accumulating all of his costume parts. And we participate in a weekly Nerf war every Friday night. And our team, our squad name is the Bone Guard from the books. And now we all have the embroidered shirts.
Nice.
But he just got the sunglasses, so he's super proud about that.
That's nice. So awesome.
In the movie,
that's super cool parenting right there. Weekly Nerf battles.
The movie is Harry and the Hendersons, and it was from '87.
I remember that.
I had to Google it while we were talking because it bugged me that I didn't remember. So if it's your homework, dear listener, go watch that and then come back to me.
Okay.
I already put her to sleep thinking about the '80s classics, but the '80s were like the lost generation for Doc. She didn't get that decade.
They weren't lost. I know exactly where I was.
Yeah, you skipped it. That's cheating.
I was in another country. It's not my fault.
Yes, but you missed like the parachute pants and the big hair and the Aquafina. Like you just missed all the cool stuff.
I was made in America, but assembled overseas.
All right, go back to the fandom stuff then. Nostalgia is lost on you.
So we already know somebody asked for your autograph, but what was it like the first time somebody asked for your autograph?
It's really odd. Edith Wharton, famous writer, had said that when her first novel came out, it was remarkable to think that a person could just walk into a bookstore and ask for the book by Edith Wharton, and the clerk without laughing, would hand it over. Um, and yeah, that was sort of the impression, because been working toward getting a book out for so long, and then suddenly there it is, and then there I am in a bookstore with a stack of these things, going, "Oh my goodness, it is here." The moment that I have spent all of this time, working towards and hoping it would happen, and uh, I think I misspelled the name of the friend that I made the book out for, unfortunately. Um, Sad. I do that with some regularity, I have to admit. And now all of my friends are like, "Hey."
I will admit, one of the things, and I loved it when I worked at a Barnes and Noble, and we had at times some very nicely high profile people come in. Like we had the lady pioneer woman, Ray Durham, I think is how you pronounce her last name. But one of the things, and I thought it was just absolutely great, was we had a person there with sticky note, and we went, no. They go, no, let me write it. No, because we had somebody with very good, very clear penmanship write
Yep.
exactly what it was on the sticky note, and it went in the book. Okay, so that when it got to her, all she had to do was copy the sticky note.
That is very wise. I mean, one of my favorite signing moments was when I had arranged a book signing at Borderlands in San Francisco, and one of their employees had graciously picked me up. I was a little disappointed because my flight came in a bit late, and they already had an author scheduled that day. It was Peter S. Beagle, who is absolutely one of my favorites. So I had asked if they could ask him to sign a copy of the new edition of The Last Unicorn for me, because I expected he would be gone by the time I got to the store. So when I arrived, he was still there, and he was signing just a few more books, signing stock. He is an extraordinarily marvelous person.
Sweet.
And so I went up and I said, "Oh, I'm actually the author who's signing after you. I have an event coming up with my first novel." And he took the next copy of The Last Unicorn off the stack, and he wrote, "For Elaine, colleague, Peter S. Beagle." And it was like, "Oh, I'm one of us." I'm a colleague with somebody that I worshipped then and worship to this day.
He is a sweet man. So
I don't do a lot of those kinds of things, mostly because it's different when you're traditionally published versus indie published, and when you got into the market. But I did one, and I went to RavenCon before they moved it too far away, and somebody asked me for an autograph. So the year my first book came out, and I guess they had read it because it did well that year on the Mill Sci-Fi side, and I was so nervous I spelled my own name wrong. And I'm like, "No, I'll buy you another copy and fix it." He goes, "No, this will be worth more."
Your name is 2 letters, J.R.
Oh my gosh, I have a Tad Williams story too, but this isn't supposed to be about telling stories about everybody else. But
No, we like Tad Williams. I've read his book, so if you want to tell that story, we've got time. Doc doesn't need to sleep.
I a while back, shortly after I had left college, which I went to in Providence, Rhode Island, I was at Rhode Island School of Design, and Tad Williams was doing a signing at the Angel Street bookshop. So I had a couple of friends still locally who were big fans, and I was in town for some other event. I was like, "Oh my goodness, I have to get in a little bit early so that we can go to Tad's signing." And as it turned out, my husband and I and this little group of friends, we were the only people there, which kind of surprised me, but one of those evenings. So, and this was a little bit before I was published, but while I was kind of waiting to hear back from the editors, I started holding the books for him, with the hardcovers, so that he could sign. And so he was chatting to me and sort of giving me all of this insider advice about how to get published and how to be published well and how to work with an editor. And it was just awesome. It was fantastic. I was willing to stand there all night, and he had a big stack of books. And then he opened one of the books and he kind of frowned at it, turned the book over and opened the back, frowned again, and realized that the book block had been inserted upside down. So this was for Silver Light, and there are character images on the end pages. So in relation to the book block, the characters were all upside down. And so while Tad is sitting there telling me all these things that I should know about publishing, he starts making all these little word bubbles for the characters. "Ah, I'm falling out of the book. Oh no, I'm upside down." Just every single character. There's like 20 of them on each of the end pages. And he's just kind of doing this whole thing while he's talking. So, the bookstore person is sort of coming over to see how it's going. Are we done yet? Are we going to be there all night? And I said, that one is mine.
Yeah.
So,
Did they make you pay for it?
they did, but yeah, just and at some point later on, like after my second series came out with Dawes, so he and I were actually with the same publisher, and I get to have dinner with him on one occasion, which was a couple of occasions, I guess, which are absolutely extraordinary. Again, one of those moments where it's like, I'm one of us. And he told a story about one of his first book signings where the store was adjacent to a shop where they could get beer, so they had, and he had signed all of the stock and had perhaps had a little beer and said, "Oh, bring me something else and I'll sign it." So the employee who was working with him kept just pulling books off the shelf, just random books. And he started signing them with random names.
That is awesome. I bet the management was not happy about that. But...
I don't know what they thought the next morning. As far as I know, they just slid them right back onto the shelf. No one was the wiser until someone pulled the book off the shelf and wondered why it had been signed Adolf Hitler. So, among others.
Oh my. So I gotta ask, and I'm not sure you can tell me, but do you have any funny or crazy fan interactions that you would like to tell us one about? Those are all some pretty amazing stories you've given us. Death scene in hallways, drunken signings.
The one of the most remarkable and unexpected interactions that I had with a fan was when my husband and I had been on a little trip. I think it was our anniversary, so we'd sort of gone away for a couple of nights. We're on our way back, and we both needed some maple syrup for friends. We'll look for a farm stand. So we're driving through western Massachusetts, the middle of absolutely nowhere on this rolling country road, and we see a farm stand. Great. Okay, let's stop and see if they have maple syrup. So they were advertising hay rides and such. So we have to drive up this long driveway, and there's a woman outside who has just harnessed these two amazing, huge black horses to the hayride. And she said, "Oh, do you want to join the hayride? We're about to start." Sure, okay. So she takes us on the hayride along with this other family, and sort of points out all the sights of the farm. And then we go back to the shop where they have a bunch of varieties of honey, which I'm also interested in. So she was kind of working, restocking some shelves and such. And suddenly she turns around to me and she says, "Your voice sounds really familiar. Have you been on any podcasts?" And how obscure is this? I'm in the middle of nowhere in this lost corner of Massachusetts at a farm. And I said, "Well, not really." And then I thought, oh, wait, actually, I've done some for the Odyssey speculative fiction workshop because I've been an instructor there. So I know that they had done some Q&As that they had put out on the Odyssey podcast. And she said, "Oh, yes, I really loved your session on world building." Wait, what? And it turned out that she was an aspiring fantasy writer who spent her time while she was working with the animals and doing various farm tasks, listening to writing podcasts. But I thought how extraordinary that she recognized my voice from having done this podcast. So you never know where these things will take you, right?
So now JR gets to actually put on his hat and think.
I don't do that.
Oh wait, no. First, we're actually going to cut to a commercial break, and because this is how JR earns his keep, is my trying to keep the outlines going and reminding me to do commercial breaks. So we'll do that.
If Princess Linathena cannot stave off civil war, then a mad goddess will surely take the throne. The king of Lithonia is dying. When he is gone, Lithonia will be ruled by either a cruel sadist or a 6-year-old boy. Princess Linathena Morthon is third in line, and she has no intention of letting her country burn. She will do whatever she must to protect her people, even if that means leaving the country she loves. When the mad goddess of Hathor sets her gaze upon Lithonia's throne, the king decides to use Princess Linathena as a bargaining chip with his closest allies in Cael'Danan. Now stranded in a foreign country, away from her center of political power, Linathena must use every tool at her command to scrape together allies and save her country from a fate worse than death. But will her would-be husband be one of those allies, or just another enemy? Author Christina Gould debuts with a dark, high-stakes political fantasy, where every new face hides a potential threat. Pick up From the Ashes and discover the shadow games that will determine the future of several nations.
All right. Thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. Doc was going to try to take over, but I don't know if you heard this in the pro show because, while we were on the commercial break, I actually fired her again and docked her pay. So it's just going to be one of those things. So yeah, she's
And
got
yet
to
I'm
earn some
still
money.
here because nobody listens to you, except for our listeners.
They like me better than you, honest. And if you want to send the hate mail to Doc Cisca at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. So right, this is where we talk about everything the great and wonderful Miss E.C. Ambrose has written. So can you give us the Reader's Digest version of your body of work?
Of all the things. So I started out with a traditional fantasy series called The Singer's Legacy. This is a generational saga in which the solutions for one generation become the problems for the next generation, which I think is often how the world works. So kings, princes, magic, some romance, that kind of thing. Tales of Blade's End is my epic fantasy novella series, in which the heroes of the Demon War believe that their battles are won until they try to go home. Dark Apostle series I've talked about a little bit. So this is the dark historical fantasy about medieval surgery. It's a 14th century barber surgeon who discovers he has an unnatural affinity with death. He learns diabolical magic to confront a tyrant, but the cost may be more than his soul. There are 5 books now complete for your binge reading pleasure.
It's like she knows me.
And then the Bone Guard series, the archaeological thrillers, there's 4 out of those so far. The Mongol's Coffin is the first one, inspired by the search for Genghis Khan's tomb. And yeah, those are just a blast to write.
You are in good company with books about the search for Genghis Khan's tomb. Tom Clancy did one of those, I believe. No, Clive Cussler. It was Clive Cussler that did one. But so those all sound fascinating. But today we're going to talk about your new novel, Drake Master. So where did you get the premise for this universe? How did you come up with the concepts?
Interestingly, The Mongol's Coffin, which was the first archaeological thriller, and Drake Master kind of came about at the same time because I have a longstanding fascination with Mongolian history and culture. So I was doing a lot of reading and thought, well, this is a lot of research to go to for just writing one book. Maybe I could write 2 that are very, very different from each other. But Drake Master actually came out of a footnote. I have a fascination with early clockworks and astronomical devices, which are often intimately intertwined. And in one of the books I was reading, there was a footnote referring to an astronomical clock made in China in around 1090. And what the footnote said was a reference to the vermilion pens of the lady's secretarial. I thought, what on earth are they talking about? So Susang's astronomical clock was built, designed and built to create really accurate horoscopes for the children of the emperor to determine which child would be the most suitable successor. And the ladies' secretarial, it was their job to write down all of the information about the horoscope so that they could get this very accurate prediction for what sort of emperor the child would be. And I sort of put that together with some ideas around their beliefs about how the stars work and what kind of influence the stars have on the planet below to create a doomsday device.
Because that's not scary enough.
Well, no.
All right. So before we dig in any deeper into that story, because we want to hear all about it, we're going to take a moment. We're going to look at this glorious cover. So what is the story of this piece of art? Like where did the concepts behind this image come from?
So at the center there, you see an armillary sphere, and this one is in the sort of classic Ming Dynasty form, supported by the 4 dragons representing the winds. And an armillary sphere is sort of an observational device where you can track different types of celestial bodies. And they show up frequently in the book. I have about 4 armillary spheres in my office right now because maybe I'm a little bit obsessed. But a friend of mine had offered to make the cover for a little giveaway version that we brought to the World Fantasy Convention and a couple of other conventions, where we took the first couple of chapters of the book as kind of a free sample. And then the editor over at Garbage Books, who's bringing out the book, kind of liked how that cover turned out. And he said, do you suppose your friend would be willing to make the cover for the finished version? And I said, I bet he would really enjoy that. So there's also an astrolabe down there, another early astronomical device, often used in navigation. And it has Mongolian script over the top that is an approximation of the title of the book, Drake Master.
Oh, that's nice. Let me see if I can zoom in enough. You did give us a high-res version. So you've got the images on the actual dragons. If you look at, it's holding the astrolabe. The glorious image of the stars that even my colorblind butt can have, and then I'm guessing this is the Mongolian script.
Yes, yep. Mongolian has a vertical script. Interestingly, they didn't have a written language until Genghis Khan started, sort of taking over most of the world at that time, and he observed the way, especially in China, their bureaucracy was extraordinarily efficient because they had that written language that they could use to capture and carry on ideas and traditions and to pass information throughout the empire. So he basically commanded a script to be created for the Mongolian language.
Interesting. All right, let's keep that on the screen while we talk. All right, Doc. Pretend like you're paying attention and ask the next question.
I was paying attention. I was going to ask, what is your 30-second elevator pitch for this?
It is a deadly race across medieval China to locate a clockwork doomsday device.
And what is it that really kind of brings your book and makes it special and unique?
It's a team of rivals, essentially. There is a Lithuanian bellmaker, the spy who was supposed to kill him, the Mongol captain who took him prisoner and impressed him into the Mongolian army, and an astronomer's daughter and a warrior monk. So each of them has a stake in the fight, and each of them wants the device or wants to stop the device for reasons of their own. So the question is, will they be able to overcome those rivalries to come together for the greater good?
Okay, and if you want to know the answer to that question, you have to buy the book.
Indeed.
Dear listener.
Yeah. So, which tropes do you really think that you utilized in Drake Master?
Which tropes?
Yeah.
So I mentioned a little bit earlier when we were talking off the air about the wounded hero and those things that I've been always attracted to, and redemption arcs are another sort of big draw for me. There's something that excites me about the idea that people can always change, that people can find a way, can find their higher self, and strive for that. Even if they're in a bad state, even if they've been responsible for some level of evil in the world. So that's definitely in there as well. And that sense of the team of rivals that I mentioned is another strong one.
I would definitely think that the redemption arc is sort of a universal trope that, I mean, unless you're a sociopath or Doc, most people do enjoy those.
I'm okay with it. There's no redeeming me. It's fine. That's why I read books. So, and so what subgenres do you feel that this really fits into? JR loves the subgenres.
Aha.
And he loves making me ask him about them.
Because you don't love them as much.
So obviously it's a historical
I do
fantasy.
not love them as much, but I do find them useful.
It's true. And
JR is like a scientist when it comes to the subgenre thing, and I'm just like,
maybe I should get some help from JR on my marketing.
So now I'm going to clip the JR as a scientist out of context and air that all the time. I'm going to buy a soundboard just to use that when she tries to make fun of me. I'm like, she's going to say, JR is a scientist. JR is a scientist. Totally.
JR is also a flaming nut job, but that's okay too.
Well,
You can use that clip for something else.
I find it fascinating because I mean, the readers have always been there for those style of stories, right? Like that I like to read about X. But it
Mhm.
wasn't until like the ebook really and the digital marketplace where
Well, that,
people started thinking about categorizing them to that degree.
Yeah, and I think I have Ken Liu to thank for the real designation for the book, which is silk punk. Uh, there have been fantasies based in Asian cultures and mythologies for a long time, but Ken Liu, aside from the fact that he's written several seminal works that would fit in it, coined the term silk punk as that sort of punking a technology that arises from that kind of culture instead of from the more traditional sort of Western cultures. So
Okay, I'm adding that to the notes. Genghis Khan and silk punk. I have never heard of this. I've been recently introduced to gas lamp punk with one of
Mhm.
Doc's friends.
gaslight or gas
Ga-
lamp.
Yeah,
yeah, gas lamp. So
silk
I'm
punk.
learning all the punk things. I thought punk was a thing we did in the '80s with rock and roll and bad
No,
boomboxes.
Jr.
But,
No, Jr.
too much dad
Jr.
jokes
doesn't
too
know
late in the
anything
night.
about punk because he's not that cool.
No,
Oh,
I was never that
Neither
cool.
am I, so that's okay.
So silk punk. Okay, is that a genre that you guys just call it among yourselves, or is that a recognized thing with the digital book shelving?
that is a good question. I know that it's been sort of percolating out there more since Ken started talking about it. How far has it perked? I'm not sure. Um, I guess I'll find out in a couple of weeks when the book comes out.
Okay. So let's talk about the story itself now. What can you tell us about your main? Well, it sounds like you have a cast of main characters. What can you tell us about your main characters? What makes them unique in the crowded field of science fiction and fantasy?
So Daedalus, who is the Lithuanian bellmaker, is unique because he's a craftsman. He's not a warrior and he's not a magic user, which are kind of the typical classes that you often see as leads in fantasy novels. Uh, he's a person whose power comes from his ability to create and to understand the creative process. So that plays out in some different ways throughout his story. In particular, at the beginning, when he basically volunteers to take over from the weapons maker for the Khan who has been assassinated. And Daedalus thinks, well, the cannons that they're making out of bronze are not that much different from the bells that I've been casting. And so he steps up thinking that this is going to be the way that he earns his freedom and can finally go home to his family. Uh, and of course, that's not exactly how it all goes down. So uh, it was interesting sort of exploring both my Lithuanian heritage through that character and then also the craft angle and what bronze casting was like then. I have some experience in that from my art school background.
So Doc is big in crafty stuff. She likes to stab yarn with needles for fun.
Nice.
So we do appreciate the arts and crafts here on the Blasters and Blades podcast. I do not have an artistic bone in my body when it comes to that. So I just watch other people and be like, oh, that's pretty.
You just watch
Um,
other people and then give us reasons to stab things.
This is true. It's it's the cross I bear to make art better for the world. So you're welcome, world. Enjoy the art and know somebody was mad at me when they made it. So besides the Lithuanian bell maker, were there any other main characters? Because you said it was a sort of a cast of people that didn't really like each other. I forget the expression you used, but were those main characters, or would those other people have been like secondary to you?
They are. There are essentially five protagonists. There are five rotating narrators through the book whose stories interweave and who clash with each other and with, of course, other characters in the book. Um, the astronomer's daughter, who herself has a lot of training as an astronomer, is kind of the person who's trying to sound the alarm about the potential danger that she sees coming in the sky. Uh, and she is the person who has a lot of scientific knowledge and sort of understanding of how the sky works. And she is trying desperately to get somebody to pay attention. And she's a little surprised at the person who finally does, who finally hears her message and takes that to heart. Um, the assassin, the spy, maybe I shouldn't say too much about that character, but was certainly a lot of fun to write. It's interesting having the variety of perspectives because I can show you different sides of the same character through what they're thinking and sort of how they're viewing the world, and then how they are viewed by other characters in the book, and how those things might change as the character arcs develop.
That's interesting. So did you write this as a braided novel where each story sort of stands alone and then you wove them together, or did you write it as a coherent narrative? Not to say that braided novels are not coherent, but it's just a different style of organizing a story.
Right, it's a little different structure. They were definitely all working together around the same set of conflicts and concerns, even though each of the characters is carrying their own sort of goal, motivation, and conflict that will propel them through the story. They're working along similar paths, but for different reasons, which is one of the things that always intrigues me about a book.
Okay. And for the listeners, if you're not familiar with the concept of a braided novel, because it would sound like every novel that has more than one POV would be, what makes braided novels unique is that if you unbraided the novel, in a true braided novel, each of those independent story arcs stands alone as a complete story. So that's the distinction. And if you want a good example of what that looks like, Kristen Catherine Rush wrote Helldivers, or the Space Divers. There's divers in the title. It's been a while since I read it. But
well, I think a good also one is like Mercedes Lackey's Obsidian Trilogy.
I haven't read that one. I've read a lot of her work.
She co-wrote it, and it's really fascinating because one's from the POV of the villain and one's from the POV of the hero character. And she co-wrote it, and you could definitely tell that one author took one POV and one took the other, and it was beautifully done.
That would be really fun to do, and then leave to the last minute where the audience doesn't know who the villain is and who the good guy is. That could be a lot of fun, because even the villains are heroes in their own story. I think another famous
that she kind of does do some of that, because there's definitely an aspect of it where you're like, wait, this is the good guy, but that's not good.
Yeah. So the one other example of that did it well was Richard Fox co-wrote a novel, and I'm drawing a blank on the title, but it was a braided novel with Jonathan Brazy. I never pronounce his name right. But that's another example. They're fun stories to read. But back to your story, because that's why we're here. So you've told us about the main protagonist. What about any secondary characters that were memorable and fun for you?
So originally there was the possibility that there would be 6 narrators, because there is an important secondary character who carries through most of the work and propels some of the action. But I decided to hold back on him a little bit, and he may, if I get the opportunity to write more books in the series, be a narrative voice in the future. But he is a Jewish person from the city of Kaifeng, so he is both Jewish and Chinese, and that's a very interesting conjunction of beliefs and understandings. So it was fun doing the research. And that's actually one of the reasons why the book is set in Kaifeng, is because it was this extraordinary sort of multicultural place. The Jewish population there settled there went around the year 800 or so, when they were invited in by a previous emperor who wanted his nation to be more cosmopolitan. And he had heard about these very learned people who were merchants in India. So he invited a group of Jewish merchants to come and settle in China. And they did. And there are still people in Kaifeng who say that they have Jewish ancestry going back to that point. But of course, some of the Chinese characters who have a stronger belief in sort of the importance of the purity of sort of ethnic the ethnic Han people, are kind of giving him the side eye, because can he really be Chinese if he is also Jewish? So there's a lot of interesting tension both within and around that character.
So that's the other thing they were known for from a historic, is they were also brought in because places that didn't have their own science base would bring them in, because they were known for their involvement in the sciences as well. It's a fascinating thing to study. But so that leads me to the next question. Is this set in actual world as we know it today, with just the extra bits added in, or is this sort of an alternate reality? Like, how would you classify the world where the story is told? Because it sounds like it's based in the modern world with the extras, almost like a modern urban fantasy would be. Is that accurate?
Right. Tim Powers had used the term secret histories to refer to historical novels in which there is a sort of vein of the speculative that's underlying the historical events. So it's a similar approach to what I did with the Dark Apostle books. And Drake Master is set into a very particular time and place, Kaifeng, China, in the year 1257. Kaifeng at that time was actually rebellion against the Mongol army, which had swept down from the north and was now heading even further south to perhaps take on the remaining Chinese empire. And Kaifeng took advantage of the fact that they were now behind the lines to rebel against their Mongolian governor. So all of that is real, and the astronomical clock that my device is based on is real. And I try to thread in as many real elements as I can, and then suggest that perhaps this entire magical underpinning has been there all along. Perhaps the beliefs that we have about the magical world are also true in the same way that those historical details are true.
So are you a classically trained historian or just someone who's self-taught to do all this?
I'm a devoted amateur historian.
Some of the best kind. All right. So Doc, calm down. You got this.
I'm laughing at you. You're supposed to be funny, right?
You're fired. I'm gonna dock your pay again. You're gonna get -0 now. So does your story? Yeah. Does your story have any bad guys that the characters confront? Obviously, we can't give away any spoilers. So what can you tell us about the antagonists without spoiling the novel?
Well, it's not spoiling too much to say that in chapter 1, while the monk character, who's one of the protagonists, is working in the temple of the Sarira, who are supposed to be to have achieved such a great degree of enlightenment that they are completely still for hundreds of years. And he does something that disturbs one of them, and the monk gets up and has an argument with him and then starts walking away, much to his dismay. And that is the character who kind of kicks off the search for the device, because he wants to know if it's still there and still waiting. And there's a lot of other characters who are also interested in getting their hands on it. So, but Master Deng, who is the dead monk who arises after so long, is the one who is carrying that plot thread out of the past and potentially into the future.
Okay.
So I think I might know how this is going to play out, but based off of how you introduced yourself at the beginning of the show. But how do you think your characters would feel if they met you and they knew you were their author and you're the reason for all of this?
For everything that, well, Yusen, who is my Mongol captain, would probably shoot me full of arrows or drive a lance through my heart right away, although he'd probably regret it a little while afterward, because there are also some benefits to going through the trials that I put them through. Elisha, who is perhaps the person that I have most abused, his fatal flaw is compassion. So I think he would be extremely dismayed to meet me, but he would quite possibly stand between me and my other characters when they came to the assault, and thus be all the more tragic because of it.
So
That's okay.
do you have you earlier you mentioned your favorite character archetype is the wounded hero, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but why?
Wow, that is a big question.
Very Socratic of you, Doc. I'm impressed.
So part of it goes to the idea that that you can't necessarily be a great hero without overcoming things. People who are pure, perfect, and unblemished, I think, have a tendency to sort of to rest on their laurels, to think everything is just fine, just as it should be. Whereas people who have been wounded are the ones who also have that urge to change things, to make things better, whether to make things better for themselves or for those who come after. Even sort of circling back around to the Lord of the Rings books that we talked about earlier, there's that great moment when Frodo is back in the Shire, but he tells Sam that he's leaving, and Sam is surprised, and Frodo says, we've saved the Shire, Sam, but not for me. Frodo starts out relatively naive and innocent and becomes wounded in various ways over the course of that narrative, and needs to come to grips with that and sort of understand himself better as a result. And that is how he displays his heroism, is through how he deals with his wounds.
So Mike Tyson actually, vaunted philosophical person that he is. The reason that the wounded people make the best heroes, although he wasn't talking about that, was his famous quote about everybody's a boxer until they get punched in the face. There's something about having that experience of real life, the intellectual meets reality phase that sort of shapes you as a person, that allows you to go forward and do the things. Whereas someone who spent their whole life in that ivory tower, whatever that ivory tower happens to be, they just don't have any grounding in reality to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're right that the people with the checkered past sometimes make the best heroes. If nothing else, they make the most interesting ones to read about.
Mm-hmm. And it changes your priorities.
Yeah.
It sort of bumps you out of potentially a straightforward track from past through present to future, and into another realm of possibilities, sometimes dangerous and uncomfortable possibilities, but also for greater rewards.
Okay.
So you've told us a bit about the universe, and can you give us kind of a hint of what to expect from? Is it a high magic universe, or is it, like you said, one of those secret histories where it's all kind of very subtly woven in?
It's relatively secret. It is set among people who largely believe that the supernatural is possible and is probable. So their lives and actions are illuminated by that understanding. One of the tropes that the book does explore that I didn't mention earlier is Shangri-La, the idea of finding a hidden valley that will open your eyes to a world that you didn't realize was present or was possible. So I'm hoping that effect comes through for the readers, that they'll have a sense that magic is sort of suffusing this world, but it's underneath the layers, and you have to sort of peel back a few layers before you get those first glimpses.
Okay. So given that this story is alt history or secret histories, with all of the alt history that's out there, because I've read a lot of alt history, I love that stuff. Is there any, if you, living or dead, if you could co-write with any other alt history author or secret history author, which would you pick? This is my nerd zone, so I'm totally in for this.
Well, I mentioned Tim Powers briefly earlier. I think that Tim Powers is phenomenal and bizarre, and it would be really cool and interesting to see what we might come up with together.
Okay. All right. That's a good answer. I'll accept it. Yeah, I like that. Doc's nerding out over there, or actually she's mocking me, but that's the same thing. Mockery is her nerd zone. So
okay,
So right now,
No, mockery is my love language when it comes to you, JR.
I'll take it. So right now, Drake Master is part of is a standalone story, but is it done at the end of this novel? Will there be more from these characters?
I certainly hope so.
Okay. So we also know that every literary universe has their own internally consistent rules of technology and or magic. So what can we expect from tech or magic that you sort of highlight in this world? I think the period you're writing in isn't one most people are familiar with. So can you sort of tell the readers what to expect?
Oh, there's a bunch of cool and awesome things, many of which were inspired by Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization of China, which is a multi-volume encyclopedia of cool knowledge from the history of China, in particular Volume 4, which is the engineering one. So if you read Volume 4, then you might get a sense of what's going to happen in the book. I've mentioned a lot of the astronomical devices, so those certainly play a significant role in a wide variety of circumstances within the book. There are also a lot of references and use of the military technology of the time, like the fire lances that the Chinese were using to defend their cities, and of course the fire drakes, the weapons that the Mongolians are using to attack those cities. There might be man-flying kites, many things, wonderful things.
All right. Well, I could nerd out on this stuff forever, and we could start talking, but we might lose the audience. So we'll let Doc move on to the next question. I can already see her like falling asleep. She's gonna start drooling on herself.
I'm not
soon.
falling asleep. She is fascinating. I'm used to.
Well, that's a backhanded compliment if I ever heard one.
Wait, I was supposed to be complimenting you?
It's in the booklet. It's on page 13.
Yeah, no.
It wasn't in the
sign
script,
that.
apparently. That's yeah.
So
I got to do a better job.
if you had to pick some piece of tech from or magic, because you have a bit of both, from your universe to have now here, what would it be?
If I could actually draw down the magic of the stars for good or ill to use upon the earth, that would be pretty awesome.
So what would you do with it, and how would you
Ill.
use it?
Yes, because that's the fun question: is how they abuse it.
For ill,
Yes.
as opposed to for good. Well, sometimes they're flip sides of the same coin. I think we can all think of perhaps a certain world leader who may need to be put in his place in a permanent fashion. And
Look, I told you I was going to be a benevolent world leader. All right, just relax.
sorry, Doc, I blew the secret. I didn't mean
It's
it.
okay. It's okay. We let JR have his delusions because, unlike other people, his delusions really don't hurt anybody else. They just
Mostly
kind of
harmless.
entertain me. Now, do you have any fantastic creatures in this?
This one, no. I do have a book that I'm shopping right now that has dragon-like aliens in it, and it was a lot of fun creating those characters by researching sort of offbeat animal skills and senses, in particular bioelectric senses. I often am inspired by scientific details like that to create new stuff. So
Okay, that is a good answer to the next question. She didn't get a chance to ask yet. But do you ever let things like your nightmares or traditional fantasy type lore inspire you as well?
one of my books that is sort of an intersection between scientific inspiration and nightmare inspiration. A lot of people say that they get inspired by dreams, but dream logic usually makes no sense at all. So I can't imagine actually writing a book from that, except that this one occasion I had this very odd dream filled with science importance. And when I woke up in the middle of the night from this dream, I thought, well, those things were very odd and kind of gruesome. Who would do a thing like that? And immediately I thought, well, the Gorgolin would do it. And then I had to know who or what are the Gorgolin. And they turned out to be a race of giant lizards who live inside of a dying volcano. And the biological bit is that for a lot of reptiles, the temperature of the egg determines the gender of the baby. So they kind of default to a particular gender if the eggs are too cold. So for these lizards, I thought, well, then the default gender is female because it's easier to have cold eggs than warm ones. And so that single idea became the basis of their entire society. So, the poor lizards would live further away from the volcano, so their eggs are likely to be colder. They would likely to have more female babies. The females would become the warriors because they're now expendable. You kind of all of these ripple effects that one decision had. So I wrote 2 books in that series, which I haven't been shopping around yet. But that's kind of the intersection between dream and biology.
I like it. So clearly this interview is winding down. We've been at it for a while, and I might nerd out too much and put Doc to sleep. So we're going to wrap this up instead. So was there anything about Drake Master that we didn't ask you that you want to tell us before we move on?
It's going to be coming out in print and in ebooks, and it may not be immediately on your bookshelves, but you should be able to order it from just about anybody once it gets out there.
All right. And is it going to be an audiobook as well for those of us that like to be read to?
I don't think there's an audiobook in the works at the current time, but the publisher and I have talked about audio in the past, so I'm hoping that we'll be able to make something happen. It would be a little tricky to find someone who can do all 5 of the characters and then also Mongolian and Chinese language.
Yeah,
and a little bit of Lithuanian.
So you'd have to almost have a ensemble cast to do the audiobook. There's a name for that
Maybe
style
so.
of audiobook, but I don't know what it's called.
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, dear listener, before we let you go, we'd like to harken back to our roots, back on the Sci-Fi Shenanigans podcast, and say that please be kind and speak your minds on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books. So do the thing. If you buy it on a platform, review it there. If you can't review it there, review it on BookBub and Goodreads. And if they won't let you over there for whatever reason, because sometimes they're discerning audiences and they don't like people. I mean, Doc was kicked off of Goodreads. I don't know why, but she probably tried to say that McCaffrey wrote sci-fi instead of fantasy, and it's a thing, people. But if you can't review it there, then write a blog, start a blog just to review the books and do the things, because your reviews matter. Pern is fantasy, changed my mind. Dragons make fantasy. But that's a.
Not if they're done by
I have
genetic
heard about
engineering.
that too.
Oh, you have thoughts on this? Okay. Do we have time for this? How deep
Probably
do these
not.
thoughts go? Okay.
Probably not.
One of these days, that is going to be a fireside chat, because Doc, I've been needling her about this topic since 2018, so it's an ongoing discussion. But
Here's the thing, JR. I am right because I heard it straight from Anne, so therefore you're wrong. By definition.
I actually took English literature classes in college, and they did tell me that once the author writes the book, he doesn't have to know, or she doesn't have to know or be right, because they interviewed, there's a famous one about the blue curtains, and they kept saying it meant this and this and this, and the author was like, no, the blue curtains were just because I like that color. So they came up with this wonderful theory that says the author might not know that.
Except for the fact that when the author specifically says something.
Except apparently she's telling a different story than the one that Todd tells, because that's the story that I know.
But she muted me. This is what happens when you give her all the admin power. It's raining cats and dogs, people. But before she mutes me again, Miss Elaine E.C. Ambrose, can you tell listeners how they can find you on the wild, wild interwebs?
You can find me on Facebook or Twitter as EC Ambrose or EC Ambrose Author. My author website is at Rocinante Books, spelled like the name of Don Quixote's horse or some spaceship that people have been watching on television or maybe reading books about. Yeah.
That's where I was going with it, although I have read Don Quixote as well.
It was Don Quixote's horse before it got that far. Or if you go over to the Guardbridge Books website, which is guardbridgebooks.co.uk, that is where you will find information about Drake Master specifically, and also the links for buying the said book and for downloading the free sample.
Okay, and free samples are good. So we will have all those links in the show notes. You can find us on Twitter at twitter.com/SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. You can email the podcast at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. That is a real address. I promise you, most of the time Doc answers it. She says that I'm not nice enough or something. I don't know. There was insults involved, and she took over the email.
I just told her I was doing it. There was nothing else to it.
So we have a Facebook group where all the shenanigans happen, which is facebook.com/groups/a Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, /groups/a Blasters and Blades podcast. We have a website at anchor.fm /blasters-and-blades. Again, anchor.fm anchor.fm/blasters tech and tech blades, where you can also support us for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on and keep Doc Cisca in her booze because she's nicer when she's drunk. So again, that's anchor.fm/blasters tech and tech blades. Or you could support the show over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts, Doc Cisca and Nick Garber, duly intoxicated. They will drink until their liver surrenders.
Never surrender. Nobody likes a quitter.
All right. Oh, and before we let you go, this is a very important question, Madam Elaine. Pineapple on pizza, yay or nay?
Oh, no.
Okay, she gets to come back. At least the right answer. All right,
Phew.
Doc, bring us home.
Okay, so thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For the absentee, as usual, Nick Garber and J.R. Handley, I'm Cisca. This was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time where we indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, picking on J.R., all things that go boom, and of course, making fun of Nick until he makes me a comic.
And he just released
so much
one, Solarian Prime. So go buy that comic, people, and do the thing. Help him keep the lights on. And thank you for stopping by. This was a lot of fun, for real. And we look forward to having you again.
Thanks
Doc,
so much.
you're fired.
Again.